Okay, everybody, let's get started. So first off, thank you for your time. Thanks for joining us today. This is the Tech Topics series. This is our 5th session here for the Eco-Design for Circular Electronics Economy. And today we have presenting and leading a discussion with us is Nirav from Framework. Let me just take you through a little bit of the administrative things for this part of the presentation. I am Mark Schaefer. I'm the project manager. Everybody is on mute. I would ask that you've got questions during the session to please type those into the chat window. We will gather those and I will feed them to Kelly, who is our moderator today, and we will work to get a good active Q&A going with Nirav. Really, the point of our sessions here is to highlight the best practices for eco-design in a circular electronics economy. And as I said, we want you to use the chat to share questions, share your own best practices, and anything else that you might have that's relevant. I believe just happenstance, today is also International E-Waste Day, I think is what it's called. Not to make e-waste, but to process and deal with e-waste. I'm afraid that every day seems to be e-waste day if we're just making it. Nonetheless, this session is actually very timely because we're talking about a really innovative product that I think really is hopefully the principles behind it get adopted by more and more folks so that it can help reduce the e-waste that we have out in the world. Just to let you know, we do have one more session that's planned on Thursday, November 4th. Barco will be speaking, and that'll be our 6th session and our final session for this year. But with that, let me turn it over to Kelly. Thanks.
Good, thanks, Mark. Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's Learning Series webinar. We're really glad that you're joining us. My name is Kelly Scanlon. I'm the Director of Environmental Policy and Research at IPC. IPC is a global trade association representing the full electronics manufacturing supply chain. Today, I am moderating our session with Nirav Patel, and my hat that I'm wearing is as a proud member of iNEMI's Eco-Design team. And so again, so glad to be with you and so glad to welcome Nirav Patel, who's the founder and CEO of Framework. So we're going to hear a lot more from him. We are starting with a presentation and then we're going to transfer into a conversation. And so we're going to welcome your questions in the chat. So before starting Nirav, before starting Framework, Nirav was part of the founding team of Oculus and led the hardware team on a path to creating some pretty cool VR tools. And so pretty cool background. Currently, he is a leader in making consumer electronics upgradable, customizable, and repairable. So he is here to tell us more about how he makes that happen and help us to learn how to participate in efforts to improve efficiencies, reduce waste in our consumer electronics industry. So again, we're going to hear from him, then we'll transition to a conversation, Q&A, maybe some show and tell to talk more about what Framework is doing. The bottom line up front, though, is that it is truly possible right now to be building excellent competitive consumer electronics that are designed to last. So let's hear directly from Nirav as to how he is making this a reality. Nirav, again, thank you for joining us today. We look forward to your presentation.
Thanks, Kelly. It's great to be here. All right, we can jump right into it. Mark, if you go to the next slide. So our mission is simultaneously extremely obvious and extremely bold, which I think most great mission statements are. So we are remaking consumer electronics to respect people and the planet. And Mark, if you could go to the next slide, we can kind of dig into what that means. You know, as Mark mentioned, actually today is International E-Waste Day, coincidentally, actually. And I think, you know, everyone here is pretty aware of what the issues are, but fundamentally what we see as the core design flaw in consumer electronics is actually kind of a business flaw. It's this idea or this assumption that consumer electronics should be disposable items, that you design this great shiny new object, you have your grand launch moment, you kind of push it out into the world and then you forget about it. But the reality for consumers and of course for the planet is that we're experiencing the results of that disposability through devices that just wear out or go out of date or break in ways that can't be repaired, and then end up with basically objects that can't be much more than e-waste because they aren't designed in a way that they can be turned back into functional, usable objects for a large part. And especially that trend has continued to increase over the last 20 years or so. And it's sort of across the board. This results in some pretty bad things. For companies, actually, it's not an amazing situation either. In that OEMs are basically competing in this constant race to the bottom, where every product being built is sort of built in a very transactional model that is really treated as a one-off object. Consumers are stuck with these very short-lived objects, and then e-waste piles up around the world. And so, Mark, if you go to the next slide. So actually, rather than starting with what we're doing differently from an actual, industrial design and engineering perspective, I think actually it's important to focus on the core innovation in what we're doing in Framework, which is actually business model innovation. So, we could change the design of our products in any way we'd like to, but ultimately, if our business still focused on this idea of that straight path from, design to factory to consumer to, maybe landfill or, hopefully ideally recycling, we'd still end up sort of stuck in the same system that revolves around disposability. So the core thing that we're doing differently is really thinking about products as objects in an ecosystem and customers as users in an installed base that we want to support with that ecosystem. And by twisting that model around, basically, rather than building these sort of transactional one-off objects, we build objects that become members of an ecosystem. And then consumers, rather than just being consumers, are actually participants in that ecosystem. And ultimately, at the end of the day, rather than having each of these objects that we build just sit out in the world and wear out, we have them sit out in the world as members of an ecosystem. And beyond the product itself, themselves, that means supporting that ecosystem with replacement parts and upgrades and tools and accessories, and basically making sure that that object and that consumer out in the world is able to stay functional and productive and happy for as long as possible. And that benefits us as a company because that means we've got a healthier and livelier and more economically active basically install base. It helps the consumer in that they have a product that once they buy it and start using it, they can continue to use it and upgrade it and repair it and modify it for as long as they'd like to. And of course, it helps the environment in that we're extending the longevity of each object that's manufactured rather than having it just wear out and potentially go out into a landfill or even just sit in a closet instead. So Mark, if you go to the next slide, we can kind of walk through a little bit about what that actually means from a product perspective as well. So our first product is the Framework laptop. We brought it into market actually earlier this year after a fairly short design sprint actually. And the core of this product, and I've got one next to me here that I'll kind of point out, is that we needed it to be basically table stakes competitive with the other products that consumers would be buying. So we didn't want to start with a highly upgradable and repairable product that fits in this very innovative business model, but is an inch thick and looks strange and is very heavy, and then sort of force consumers to make this very difficult choice of do I want the product that respects my rights as a consumer and respects the environment, or do I want the thin and sleek, pretty product that I would have otherwise bought? That's actually a very challenging choice, even for all of us who are sort of highly attuned to the challenges around e-waste. And so what we did from the outset is basically look at, what do people need out of their products, and especially in this case, out of their notebooks, and what are the competitive products offering? And so we started with actually size and weight and a design envelope that we wanted to fit into. And then within that, we designed for modularity and repairability and upgradability. And so I can kind of point out some of the features. I don't know if you want to maybe turn off the slides or hide the slides, or folks can see this pretty readily.
Yeah, let me kill my sharing. Maybe that'll let you. They'll get everybody to focus on you. Let me know when you want to go back to the slides.
Yeah, sure, definitely. So this is the Framework laptop. This is actually a pre-release version, so there's some minor differences compared to what's out in the market today. That's just what I happen to have on hand. But you can see just immediately at the outset from a few feet away, it looks and feels and behaves like a normal thin and light premium notebook. So good materials, highly recyclable materials, actually happen to be post-consumer recycled as well. to a large percentage. And then immediately as you get into the product itself, it still looks and feels very familiar. Any consumer using this doesn't really have to change their usage patterns and behaviors in day-to-day use, which really was sort of a core part of what our design philosophy was. And then as you go sort of a level deeper, the customization and upgradability and repairability becomes apparent. So one of the choices that we made, for example, is having these expansion cards to set the ports that are on the system, as opposed to sort of forcing consumers to bear with whatever ports that we decided to use. So actually at order time, consumers get to configure each of these 4 expansion card bays into whatever ports they'd like. So this is just a micro SD card, for example. But we have, USB-A and USB-C, HDMI DisplayPort, and so on. And that just sort of like from day one gives users and consumers the ability to start to experience that customization upgrade and really feel that they can have a product that is fit to them, as opposed to being this thing that's been manufactured and put out there for them to sort of have to fit themselves into. But then beyond that, of course, the really interesting things start to happen as you get inside the machine. And so we've designed this to be extremely straightforward for a consumer who's potentially never been inside of a PC or any other consumer electronics product to be able to figure out. So we have basically a series of step-by-step guides that are just photo-based and very easy to follow. And what we've done beyond that as well is put labels and QR codes on every product and every module that we have. So there's actually one on the bottom of the laptop itself. And then as you get inside, all of the modules within also have that. And the idea there is that you can actually scan any of these QR codes with your phone and get taken directly to those replacement guides, being able to get upgrade parts. And over time, actually even being able to scan those to get the best path to recycling that object, or even being able to repost it onto our marketplace to be able to find another consumer to extend the life of that object or that product, rather than it sitting in a closet or going out into recycling. And that's sort of like a core part of what we think of as sort of the best path to circularity, which is, circularity in actual normal functioning condition before it needs to be broken back down into commodities. And then beyond that, we've just, made a lot of actually really obvious design choices, like socketing memory and storage rather than soldering it down, using, very common fasteners rather than adhesives. And, we've done all of that still within this very thin and light envelope, which I think just shows that, a lot of the sort of common sense, maybe arguments against designing for repairability are, not actually quite right. That, for a product like a notebook, it is actually entirely possible to build a thin and light and high performance product that's also highly repairable. And beyond that, of course, we've also designed even the main board itself to be replaceable for users who want to get performance upgrades. And that's one really core module that from an environmental perspective is, of course, quite impactful because of the amount of silicon baked into that board. And is one of those objects that we actually also want to extend the functional longevity of as much as possible. So that's kind of like a very high level overview, and there's a ton more information online. But ultimately, it really is that core philosophy of embracing modularity to enable a long-lived ecosystem rather than just treating products as one-off objects. And that was actually kind of the end of the slide part of this, and so definitely happy to answer any questions or hear anyone's thoughts or concerns or anything.
Great, Nirav, thank you. And we love the show and tell and the ability to kind of get into the inner workings of what it is that you've built. So cool, thank you for that. Let me start with some questions that actually came into the chat from Robert Rose, but I do encourage other participants to put your questions into the chat so that we can pose them to Nirav and have that conversation. And so just also, we're together today for about a half an hour, but if the Q&A really, there's a lot of it, then we'll stay on a little bit longer, but just wanted to let folks know that we have another 10-15 minutes or so left to our conversation. Okay, Robert Rose is asking about the connectors that you were just talking about. So what connector type do you use to ensure future upgrades and card swap?
Yeah, sure. So we actually use USB-C as a physical connector, which is great in that, there's a long roadmap and a very healthy active ecosystem around that connector already. So just from, pure availability, there's no risk there. But also from a protocol standpoint, we continue to see new protocols getting routed through USB-C, which helps us sort of be able to extend that interface longevity for the foreseeable future. And so being able to tunnel not just USB data and power, but also protocols like DisplayPort, Thunderbolt, and future versions of USB really makes it a pretty promising and easy and robust interface to use.
Great. Okay. And a follow on batteries. So this is mentioning batteries, but thinking about even all the other components. How do you ensure safe removal? So I'm thinking about the insertion and removal of these different parts, in particular batteries. How is that? How did you make that happen?
Yeah, and battery is really the only, probably the only sensitive one. Everything's pretty robust, and we've been out now in market for a few months, and I've seen users, not actually need repairs, but just want to tinker with their machines and just swap things in and out. And for the most part, it's gone quite well. Obviously we have a relatively tech savvy audience today, which makes that more straightforward. But for batteries especially, the core of it is that it's not something that you need to replace particularly often. And we do put warnings in both our instruction guide and on the module itself very carefully, like telling the user that this is something you have to handle fairly carefully. And so in our step-by-step guide, basically, we just show people in photos and, ultimately over time, video as well. Here's the right way to handle this. Here's, the exact way to disconnect the connector, unscrew the fasteners, be able to hold it from the plastic frame rather than, touching, the soft polymer parts of it. And then how to handle that object once it's out of your system to be able to recycle it or store it or, reship it out or whatever else needs to be done to it.
And do you do take back, or does this, again, you're sending it to a different end of life management?
We don't currently do take back, but actually one thing that we are building as part of our ecosystem model is a marketplace. And so, we actually just launched the first phase of it this week, which is a pretty standard, us to consumer e-commerce store where users can buy replacement parts and upgrades. That is something that we'll be extending over time to enable consumer to consumer resale and third party resale of new and refurbished and used parts. And so basically the first stage that we want people to do with any object that they're taking out of their system is to see if there's any economic value to someone else in the world by putting it into that marketplace.
Right.
And if there's not, then send it out into a known good recycler.
So Rakesh has asked, can you please share if there were additional measures you took in terms of risk management of product design based on ISO 1210 or similar to ensure safety during and after repairs?
I'm not super familiar with that.
Yeah, I'm not either,
So I guess maybe a more, layman's terms version of that question would be.
Well, great. I guess I'm thinking more about terms of risk management. Did you, how do you ensure that safety of the parts, as well as, I think you were just kind of even answering it maybe about how you're you're communicating with folks about what it is that you're making and giving to them and how to work with that safely. So Rakesh, we'll ask you if you want to clarify so you can help us to understand this and teach us more about what 1210 is or 12100 is. So going back to thinking about how you actually make things connect in the framework laptop. So the question is coming in: displays usually need adhesive to bond to the lens. So if you're moving more towards fasteners for other parts, for those parts that really need adhesive, how are you attaching things?
Yeah, sure. I mean, display was an interesting one. This was a fun problem to solve, and we kind of did it in a pretty interesting way. So the bezel on the laptop is actually magnet attached instead of being held in with adhesives. And we did that deliberately, both to make it easy to access the display and actually to make it a cosmetically upgradable object. So users can get, orange or white or green or whatever other color they want bezels and be able to really personalize their product while also making that improvement to repairability. So basically, once you take that bezel off, the display actually is held in with fasteners instead of adhesive. And so basically, we have basically a very simple aluminum bracket that is adhered to the back of the panel, which has basically mounts for fasteners, which then get screwed into bosses that are in the A cover here.
Slick. And I like, I'm sorry, I like the sound effects. That satisfying sound.
It is actually satisfying. Yeah, they're including like the expansion cards as well. There's some like physically satisfying things to play with on the product.
Yeah. So let me jump back because Rakesh wrote back in. Thank you, Rakesh. Did you come across regards to ensuring data security or cybersecurity? For example, someone replacing the chipset with spyware, or is this scenario only for Hollywood movies?
Yeah, sure. That's an interesting one. I mean, really the core of, from a data security standpoint, really the core of it is being able to have your data on the SSD that's on there and being able to then manage. If you're replacing the main board by itself or want to resell the main board, you can literally just take your drive off of it, put the main board out into the world and keep your drive and reuse it or put it into a new main board or wipe it or do whatever you'd like. So from that perspective, it's all quite straightforward. Modern PCs have fairly secure boot chains with secure boot and other technologies that make basically data security and encryption and everything quite straightforward compared to how it's been in the past.
Yeah. Okay. But it's definitely a factor you're considering.
Yeah, and actually, it's kind of interesting. What we hear a lot from businesses actually is that one of the big problems they have with some notebooks like MacBooks, especially, is that because the storage is soldered, some companies actually have requirements to literally drill through the machine in the right spot to physically destroy the storage rather than being able to just remove the storage and reuse the rest of the machine, which is kind of crazy, especially from an e-waste perspective.
Yes, but necessary. So, and these questions are, I'm so glad the audience is asking questions. They're on a variety of different topics. So while I'm trying to group them, I might not be doing the best job. So we're going to jump a little bit about materials. So have you considered or tested biodegradable substrates for printed circuit boards?
Yeah, this is interesting. I mean, there's actually a lot of material, like I would say both low-hanging and not particularly low-hanging materials innovation that needs to happen in consumer electronics. And so just like kind of going into different parts of the product, our housing, for example, is, I think right now it's 50 or 55% post-consumer recycled. Aluminum, our plastics for the most part average around 30%. And it feels like, like coming into this, from the outside as someone who's not a materials engineer, I went in with all right, well, we're at 30%. Why don't we just do like 50%? And then, every single supplier down the line and all the resin suppliers and tier below them come back with well, we just can't do that. We can't make it robust and reliable enough. It'll never work. And we pushed on that a bit. And it turns out that actually drop survival and robustness is quite challenging, especially with plastics. And I know the question was about PCBs themselves. But basically the general challenge is that to a large extent, there are things that feel incredibly obvious to me personally that I would love to see happen, but just require an enormous amount of validation effort to be able to meet the normal reliability and robustness requirements for an electronics product. So we do want to be on the leading edge of that as a company with smaller volume that makes it both easier in some ways and harder in some ways for us to be on the leading edge, and that we don't necessarily have the volume today to be able to push the sub suppliers that we work with to head in directions where they're investing a lot of time and money into materials development. But at the same time, because the volumes are not as big as the big OEMs today, it also means that we can kind of be the pilot product for some companies that are trying to do more innovative things with materials.
Okay. And we have a lot of questions still, but that makes I have my own questions about that, right? How do you? Let me think. My question is, are you designing for environment? Are you considering that in your materiality choices, your material assessments? Not only what's available and works, but also, and is it better, more sustainable? Do you have data to support that it's, quote, better?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I mean, I would say the thing that we're doing today, because we are a small company moving incredibly quickly, is taking the very obvious low-hanging things, like basically just taking the best resins and the best aluminum that's available on the open market. So for us today, that's because we're using formed aluminum, we can get 50% post-consumer recycled aluminum relatively easily. We can get that 30 to 35% post-consumer recycled PC or PCABS. And that's all stuff that we get to do just right off the bat by, paying literally a few cents more in some cases to get, to get that plastic that, has, less environmental impact because there's less resource extraction involved and less energy involved in the processing. But then from there, we do want to then take those next steps and be able to push towards, push further, which will then involve some material development. And then to your point, that goes into like, well, how do we actually ensure that the new material development that we're doing is actually more efficient than or better for the environment than what's available today? And luckily there as well, actually, there is quite a lot of good research and there are a lot of good papers there. And a lot of like companies like Covestro and LG Chem and others are actually doing quite a lot of research in these areas. And I think it still is sort of that gap from the research into getting into a product that we have to overcome for many of these.
Yeah, and so we did have a question about the timing. I'm assuming many of our audience members were as surprised as I was when you're like, it was 18 months for you to turn it around.
That's right. Yeah.
Holy guacamole. So Niels is saying, wow, that was quick. Yeah, exclamation point. So how far are you as a newer company with planning a hardware ecosystem together with other companies? It's very logical for the expansion ports, but what about other modules? And that my question then is, you've talked a lot about the we. Who is your we?
Sure.
Who are you working with? Who are your partners?
Yeah, sure. So I'll start with the first one there. So the expansion card, just as the most obvious one, that is something we've actually released as an open source module design. We've referenced designs and documentation under open licenses. And we're already seeing some pretty interesting development going on from both individual hobbyists and small companies in the electronics space, basically coming up with interesting designs and seeing if the community is interested in them. And that's something that we're going to continue to see occur over time. And then as we look at the rest of the product, that is actually like basically every part of the product is something that we'd love to bring third parties into. And ultimately, it's a question of ROI. Where, for us, part of this ecosystem mentality is that we want to build the install base to be large enough that it makes sense for a third party to be able to come in and make a main board and be able to recoup their investment because the install base is big enough that they can actually get enough attached for it to work. And so for something like an expansion card, because, it is something simple enough that an individual can design and build and even bring into production, that's something that we don't need a particularly big install base to start to enable, which is why we're starting to see it already. But to get something like a main board, that is, of course, substantially more complex and expensive. And that's going to be something that will take a little bit longer for us to build enough of an install base to attract those third parties.
Yeah. Okay. So, but that's kind of part of your business model.
Exactly. Yeah, that's the goal.
Baked in. Yeah, baked in. So Mark has asked about the QR coding that's kind of littered throughout the framework, the laptop. Are your suppliers giving you that content that goes into the QR code, or are you having to add that yourself?
So today, that's all stuff that we're adding and developing, and we write the content, we create the guides. Over time, it is something that we'd love to have basically members of the ecosystem, whether that's module makers or our own sub-suppliers also participating there.
Okay. And so we have a question from William Neal. So, hey, William, he's, I don't know for sure, but I'm pretty sure he's still with DG Environment, Director General Environment at the European Commission in Brussels. And if it's not that William Neal, I'm sorry, but I'm pretty sure it is. His question is, so cool that we have a policymaker online and somebody who's like really interested in building electronics better. And what does that mean for the circular economy and their ambitious plans? So his question is, do you expect this to stimulate parts harvesting and reuse at end of life of the product? So
absolutely,
take back, et cetera. How are you circularizing?
Yeah, absolutely. That is what we would love to see. And that goes in a bunch of different directions. For things like off-the-shelf modules that we've socketed everywhere we could, it's relatively straightforward since those are objects that can hook into existing ecosystems. But even for things like, our mainboard, for example, which is the single most expensive and, environmentally, impactful part of the product, we want to extend the life of that mainboard inside or outside of a laptop. So, at end of life, we want someone to be able to take, potentially a mainboard out of a really beaten up laptop and decide that the mainboard itself is still, or determine that the mainboard itself is still functional and be able to put that into a new shell and extend the life, or even be able to take it out of a laptop and put it into just a small basic case to use it as a desktop PC. And that's
Cool.
something that it just feels totally obvious to take this, expensive and advanced piece of silicon that, generated an enormous amount of carbon impact when it was manufactured and not have it go into a landfill and become sand, but have it go into, another object to be reusable in functional form.
Okay. Yeah. So Niels is asking, before going worldwide, have you already come across legal obstacles in different parts of the world, in particular for the sale of the refurbished products, but also for the user-to-user marketplace? So I think that's a good follow-on question to what you were just stating.
Sure. Yeah, that is definitely going to be challenging. I mean, luckily for us, there is precedent, and there's actually a lot of infrastructure that makes, especially like just the basic like tax ramifications of selling things around from consumer to consumer, being a marketplace facilitator and having things, cross borders. Basically in 2021, it's easier than it has been in the past, just because there's, companies like Stripe or Flexport or, other companies out there that sort of help us build the back end of this in a way where we don't have to do it all from scratch ourselves.
Yeah. Okay. And do you have, as part of your team, folks who are tracking some of the policy developments such that what you're building is not reacting to these policies on circularity, but are actually out ahead of them and proactively? I mean, you're already proactively because you're already designing for repairability. But yeah, how do you stay on top and ahead of that wave?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. We don't have someone on staff today who's dedicated to that. We try to stay aware, and then of course we've got a bunch of great partners and friends in the industry who poke us and ping us for ideas or questions, or let us know when there are evolutions happening out there in the space.
Yeah. Okay. And yeah, from my role as a government relations person, definitely keep on top of that because it's such a dynamic space right now with that push. So we do have a question. Your company seems to already be ready for Fair Repair Act in the US, and right to repair, repairability index, et cetera. That's kind of this kind of global landscape on these policies. Are there any aspects where you plan to work further?
Yeah, I mean, just generally on the whole, all those regulations are great. Actually, we love those, and we're glad to see the continued traction that's occurring globally. And it's really we do think that there's going to be just continue to be so much industry pushback that ultimately the things that get passed for the most part will be, good, but perhaps limited. And, then companies sort of facing those regulations are going to do the bare minimum steps to comply with the letter of the law where they're forced to. Whereas for us, it really is thinking about what is the best thing for the consumer, what is the best thing for the environment, and going as far as we can, whatever that means at each time point.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm impressed, Nirav. I mean, this is really, you've got your head screwed on in the, tightly and in the right direction, yet still you're flexible and bending to, and being receptive to a lot here. So it's refreshing, and I thank you for that. We are just about actually over time, but I wanted to ask you another question here from Robert. Is there anything you would highlight as a true innovation besides what you already answered and talked about? And actually, that was one of my questions, and I think it's a good closing question, which is, what's coming next? What is that true innovation? Where are you planning to do something even bigger? Wow.
Yeah, sure. No, that's interesting. I mean, and folks were surprised at the 18 months as well. And the core of this is that there's very little invention involved. If a team of less than 20 people in 18 months in the middle of a pandemic and a silicon and logistics crunch can build a competitive product that is highly repairable and upgradable and customizable, why can't the companies that are already in the space do that? Which kind of just points back to the core innovation really being a business model and a philosophy and a mission innovation that, we're actually really genuinely deeply attuned to what is respectful to consumers and respectful to the environment. And that's what we build our products to do. And that's why we're able to do it with such a small team, with such a short period of time, with actually not a lot of funding either. And so as we go forward, it's really doubling down on that. It's, taking what we've done on this first product in this first category and continuing to expand category at a time across consumer electronics and continuing to follow that same philosophy of building great competitive products that consumers can love, that respect their rights and respect the environment.
Thank you. And I love that you use the word respect so many times in that statement, because I think that's part of it. It's respecting the ecosystem and the interconnectedness of us as humans and of everything that we make. And that, again, we're born from nature, and why are we not listening to nature as we build what we're doing? So you've got that ingrained in what you want and what you want to see for framework and everything you make. So thank you, Nirav. I'll leave it to you for a last word, and then after you, we'll turn it back to Mark Schaefer to wrap up the session. So thank you.
Thanks, Kelly. And I guess just, one note, obviously we want to sell, our products, and that's, good for us as a business. But ultimately, actually, the message we have for consumers is, if you have a notebook that works today, keep using it, repair it any way that you can. And then eventually, someday in the future, if you ever need one, we're there for you.
Yeah. Cool.
Thanks, Kelly.
Thanks, Nirav.
So yes, absolutely. That was fantastic. Thank you so much. I enjoyed that discussion. I'd love for you to stay on the line and let me talk to you for like an hour or 2 or 3 or 4 more, because there's just so many neat things that you're doing, and I'd like to hear more about it. But we don't have that time today. So I do want to let folks know that we can continue this conversation. We have another Tech Topic series on November 4th with Barco. We're still working on seeing if we can get a second speaker to come in and join, but at the very least we'll have Barco here talking about what they're doing. I believe they're going to talk about their eco sourcing, is what they called it to us. I did put in the chat window the link to register for this session if you're interested. Also, this team, the iNEMI team, is actually working on some short videos from some of our earlier presentations, which we hope to be, which will be out by the end of the year, hopefully earlier than that, and we'll let all of you know when they're available, so that you can see some of the summaries and the overall findings of the team. And we'll certainly be incorporating the things that we learned here today into those discussions. So I want to thank you all again for your attention, for joining us, and definitely for Nirav for speaking and talking about the innovations, or just sort of the common business practices that you're doing that seem innovative because of the way the industry has gone today. And thanks for Kelly and the team here for joining and supporting this effort. So thanks, everybody. Take care. Have a safe day.
Okay.
Thanks.